good evening or good morning, whichever time you're going to broadcast this. My name is Manish Chandi, and I've been asked to kind of talk about the Andaman Nicobar, a place which is very close to me. And it's close because even though I'm not there currently, I'm very far away from it physically, mentally, and in my all my work as a researcher, as after my college years, was spent in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, mostly in the Nicobar and the Andaman as well. Um, and the work that I have done is I studied economics in Madras. And after a point, I wasn't particularly clear and sure as to where I wanted to go with with that version of being taught that kind of economics in those years in the 90s. But I was very clear and I knew that I wanted to spend my time working with local communities, environment, conservation. So these are the places that think that actually got my fancy and my interest basically. So I went on eventually. I was there as a researcher, as a volunteer originally, working with the Andaman Nicobar environmental team from 1995 till 2019. When I was being working with a long time, it's about close to about 25 years. And the work that I have conducted is varied. I began by doing a small restoration program in the station I was established and worked with my colleagues. It's called the Andaman Environment Team. We planted up trees. We created a water harvesting structure which is still functional. We don't have government water supply at all. We only have been using the rainwater which we've harvested and so on. And not a rule. It's just that it just became so easy and functional. We're just depending on nature to be able to cater to our needs. We did a bit of farming as well. Of course, we were buying things in the market and so on. But after and beyond all that work at the base station, I got interested in research and I went on to try and understand various issues in the islands vis-a-vis the communities that live there. So my work has actually dabbled in a bit of social and cultural anthropology as well. Even though I wasn't specifically trained in it as a scholar, I pushed myself into it, and it got my interest, and I pursued it. So I initially began working in the Andamans itself, with one or two short trips to the Nicobars, just to visit and see the place and understand issues there. Or I was sent on work, and I initially began with one of a big study, which was to understand how the settler communities in the Andamans were dealing with a neighboring indigenous tribal community who continue to live there, called the Jarawa. So that was the first piece of work. It took me about a year and a half to complete the field work. So I visited virtually every village along the eastern border of the tribal reserve. So the western side is all sea of the tribal reserve in the Andamans. The way I will present the Andaman Nicobar Islands to you is this. If you look at the map of India, you see these small dots on the in the Bay of Bengal, between the Andaman Sea and Bay of Bengal, and these actually are two different island archipelagos. Archipelago is basically a group of islands. So the Andaman are a separate group, and the Nicobars are a separate group. But together they form a union territory called the Andaman Nicobar Islands, and they're administered by a single administration, a union territory administration, governmental administration, and that's how they actually kind of have been worked on and kind of used over the past from 1947 onwards. Prior to that, to give you a brief history as to what and how the Andaman Nicobar came into being in India's hands, before got rid of colonial enterprise in India, the Andamans actually played a very important role as a penal colony, and that's how it kind of came into prominence. Because before that, we're talking about the 1800s, 1700s, 1600s, and before. Virtually, very few people probably knew about the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. It's only sailors, people who were pirates who were in the Malay archipelago, people who had sailed from, say, Tamil Nadu or from the south coast of India, even as far back as Ashoka's time, from Orissa, kingdom of Kanishka, the people had moved from there to Sumatra and Bali, along with the spread of enterprise in those centuries. Even how religion went into Bali, Hinduism went across to Bali. It's an entire historical kind of stream of knowledge that is we know of today. Along the path to reach those places were the Andaman and Nicobar, and they were known to have been or were occupied by tribal communities living on the island, on the both the Andaman and Nicobar. And people saw them very differently in those years, and even today. the very fact that we refer to them as tribal communities or as indigenous people or as Adivasis and so on is first of all a recognition that somebody is slightly different from yourself, myself. So whoever they may be, wherever they may be in our country or anywhere else. So the Andamans itself um, originally consisted of about 13 odd different tribes in the Andaman itself, from Little Andaman in the south all the way up to northern Andaman tip, Landfall Island, and so on. And there are about close to 600 odd islands in the entire chain, of which a large number of them are, most of them are in the Andaman itself, because they consist of small, tiny islands. Some are even rocks, outcrops, with a little bit of vegetation on them, or a little beach maybe. Like Tuft, there's a small island called Tuft Island, which most people, even in the Andaman, probably haven't gone to. It's a little bigger than my house or my room. It's just a small little island, and it's largely a rock. And it's got beach sand which is deposited in one edge. So all rest of it is just rock, no tree growing on it. But it's a boat has to stop a little further away. You walk get on the reef, and then get across onto the little islet. That's a small island. You also have large islands like South Andaman, Middle Andaman, and North Andaman. So and Little Andaman, of course. So when one understands or thinks about or the geography and the physical description of the islands, you will eventually encounter these four major islands. Little Andaman in the south is a separate island. Further north of it are a couple of other small islands. You come down to South Andaman, which is the next largest island, connected with or even associated with very small islands along the eastern side, a few on the west, and on the south as well. And very just close beyond that, separated by a body of water not more than 100, 200 meters distance, like virtually like a river, but actually it's a strait of water between these two islands is the Middle Andaman. And another large island. Then you go to North Andaman, between Middle and North. So these four large island systems are the places which are mostly occupied by humans, people. And all the other tiny islands all around are uninhabited islands. But nearly all of them are wildlife part of wildlife parks or sanctuaries. So that's another interesting tidbit that people should understand, that when we talk about Andaman Nicobar, it's this geography, the human geography and the ecological geography of the entire archipelago, of these four large island systems which have people living on them, as well as natural forested ecosystems and marine ecosystems, beach systems, and so on and so forth. While they're also surrounded and dotted with these many other small islands associated or close by or next to them, and so on and so forth. And in that natural ecosystem are a varied group of wildlife that also was part of my interest. I was working with a group who was primarily involved in wildlife conservation and wildlife research, or at least for crocodiles, sea turtles, marine fauna and flora, even terrestrial flora and fauna. Students used to come there to ANET, they still do, to work in or understand ecosystems in the Andaman Nicobar, or even ask questions about certain aspects of those ecosystems or even biological systems or species. So that's where my work began, and I was one of the only few people doing work on the social ecosystem of communities and people. So, like I told you a little earlier on, the islands themselves originally had about 13 odd tribes, and the colonial enterprise entered the Andamans finally after the mutiny revolt in mainland India. Then British government of India was looking for a place to kind of detain and suppress the freedom movement and so on, by having a place where people could be sent to jail and not be able to escape. The Andamans was seen as a very strategic location, and even at that point of time, an island system far out at sea, where escape is next to impossible, and you can only escape within the entire landmass. You can't swim the seas unless you make a raft, and so even that's a very risky enterprise, and saying of guarantee of success is very low of being able to reach another mainland from there, and so on. Anyway, there's lots of good material that is available, a lot of bad material also available to read, which is here and there. But there are most of the old accounts about the Andaman and Nicobar are very interesting, and they form the basis of knowledge about the early history of the Andaman Nicobar chain. Talking about those communities who live on the islands, people have looked at them with great skepticism and also with a lot of curiosity ever since people knew about these communities who used to live on these islands. It's unfortunate, but it's a fact that through both colonial enterprise and imperialistic kind of colonizing of islands, whether they were colonial British or Indians or whoever they were, always viewed the Andaman Islanders. I'm not talking about the Nicobar Islands now. I'm talking about the Andaman Islanders, just because of difference in physical features, of color, and the way of life of living in the forest, and a way in which all our forefathers at one point of time lived. There weren't any cloth factories, or they only use material from their surroundings to kind of adorn themselves or clothe themselves. So there's this huge curiosity factor which kind of developed even then, and it went in various directions. At one level, there were pirates from both Thailand and Malaysia, who would come and capture these people from the island, saying that they were dark-skinned, animal-like people, and so on and so forth, and take them to as curiosities to courts in both Thailand and Malaysia, or even as slaves, like how the slave trade took people from Africa to the Americas and so on, and even to India also people who run. These people were captured from pirate ships and so on and so forth, which by itself generated an entire fear of the what we know as an outside world. So most of the islanders started becoming hostile to most outsiders. They were very skeptical because and with very well-founded imaginations of people being coming there to harm themselves or to harm their families and their community and so on. That entire hostility that kind of developed was seen to be tamed by colonizers who went there, from the British colonial enterprise to or even our own Indian government, or even if you or I go there, we will try and make friends first before trying to do anything else, right? Like even you and I, we never met before. We start with an introduction. Who are you? I mean, try and make friends rather than kind of shout at each other and kind of try and kill each other. That's the entire way the Andamans was eventually occupied. And there again is a very detailed history as to why certain tribes were hostile and why some were not. Uh, I will need a lot more time than a few of these minutes to kind of tell you all that. But it suffices to say that with this the issue of slave trade, the Andamanese, whichever tribe they belong to, had developed a sense of hostility and negativity towards any outside contact. That in itself is what also probably held them and allowed them to kind of survive until the present day and age, through these many centuries. Firstly, because there was very little contact with the outside world, and the first contact that they had was also of subjugation, and they tried to kind of thwart that by bows and arrows that they were using, weapons that they would use that any human community would do, and that combined with the fact that there were also people who came as colonizers who also felt that yes, violence is not the way forward. We need to be able to find a more peaceable way of being able to coexist, or at least find a way of not harming their own lives and so on, which eventually actually resulted in the field of anthropology becoming a tool through both administration as an administrative tool to kind of understand communities, because there are so many cultural ethnicities, not just in the Andaman Nicobar, but across the world. And anyway, so with the colonial enterprise, because these people had been isolated for the longest time, they were resistant to various common diseases or infections that our communities on the mainlands were more used to or more accustomed to. And therefore, when with the British colonial enterprise that came in to be there, and the penal colony particularly, a lot of X, Y's, and Z's are there in the entire equation of what happened. But to sum it up, was that in the 25 or 50 years that the colonial enterprise was there in the Andaman Islands, the original inhabitants who became friendly and who were in communication and living alongside the colonial enterprise in South Andaman particularly, they started picking up a lot of sexually transmitted diseases from the people in the jail and so on and so forth. And that led from like one step went on to the next step, the third step, the fourth step. It moved from tribe to tribe to tribe, tribe to tribe, eventually decimating virtually the entire population. And there were communities who were hostile, continued to be hostile, because the British, who made friends with some group of Andamanese, the people who were enemies of those people, of those other islanders, the people in the islands themselves, like they say the Jarawa, for instance, I'm talking about them, they were hostile to another community in the islands itself, but they were friendly to others. They could have been friendly to the British as well if the British went and contacted them first. But because the British had contacted another tribe called the Akabia, who were a South Andaman tribe, who were traditional enemies, or they had this hostility between them and the Jarawa, whom we call the Jarawa. They remained hostile and remained aloof from the settlement, and therefore saved themselves of being infected or being. That's how they actually survived. Others, they also won't be here today. And that because they stayed aloof, stayed away in the forest, they only come and attack or steal or take away things and so on and so forth. That is the only amount of contact that they had. So when people think of these islanders being isolated, it's not a wrong idea, but it's a wrong notion. The notion itself is different. They actually were not isolated for the past, say, 2 to 3 centuries. They were isolated until then for a long, long time. But once contact happened through colonization of these islands, they were not isolated at all. And secondly, also want you to remember, even though in today's day and age, taking a glass to drink water or whatever is just commonplace, we have actually to come and think about it. We have actually manufactured this glass, your glass bottle, glass tumbler, whatever. It comes from a factory where silica is used to make glass, and then eventually comes with glass. A lot of those glass pieces of bottles also used to float across the ocean and kind of reach the islands, even those years. So glass chips of bottles and stuff like that were used by the Andamanese without knowing where they came from as small knife tools because they were sharp. Sometimes they could be very sharp. That. So I'm saying what I'm talking about, and bringing that as an example or an illustration is to show even the sea did not allow so much of isolation. Contact was happening in different forms of things floating up ashore and people seeing curious about what is coming up, where it's come from, and using it in a different way and so on and so forth. So from an approximated population of something like 5,000 odd indigenous islanders who belong to these 12, 13 tribes, from 1869 till 1947, there was no real count. It's just an estimate. Because people are living in deep forests and here and there, and the British had a very, very small setup in Ross Island and in South Andaman, and only used to sail across to the other islands with the friendly Andamanese to visit them or to whatever else they were doing. So nobody actually has a real number of what number of Andaman Islanders originally existed in the Andamans. Only more recently do we have statistics about the population. And the first statistic that comes to us regarding the people who eventually kind of remained after virtually all the tribes had become nearly extinct was a count of 19 people. We're not talking about Jarawa. The Jarawa were uncounted and they were still hostile and they were living in the forest. Nobody was able to count them or know how many people existed. But from the other communities who originally numbered close to some thousands, a few thousands, there were just 19 people remaining. And out of those 19 people, there were people who belonged, one person from one particular tribe, two people from another tribe, four people from, say, another tribe, and so on and so forth. I mean, I'm not giving the exact numbers, but just illustrating it. But they were just scattered, remnant people from different tribes over there. And it was in 1956 that the government of India, who had already taken control of the Andaman after the British had left, because the British had handed over the Andaman Nicobar to India. And as you know, when they left South Asia, a Pakistan was created, East Pakistan, which became Bangladesh, was created, a Burma was created. These all were under colonial rule and administration through the colonial enterprise of the East India Company and so on. And when they left, Andaman Nicobar was handed over to India, given to India, saying, this is some place that we have brought mutineers and sepoy mutineers from your country or your lands. They're here. You guys can kind of continue to hold that in your administration. That's how it was handed over to India. So that's I think another important facet that one should understand and keep in the background or keep in mind when we talk about how we relate to these original islanders. They are Indians, of course, today. They're under the Indian flag, Union Territory of India, and so on. But at one point of time, not very far back in the future, very, very less than a century ago, they were not part of any country or anything like that. They were just people living on their own land, on their own islands. And they have always been hunter-gatherers. Now, who are these hunter-gatherers? We think of them as people who would only go and hunt and gather food. Of course, that's how they would make their living. but they also had social systems. That's something that most of us, when we think about tribal communities in this fashion, kind of tend to forget that these are, and what I mean by social systems is how we think of or describe a culture, or we're talking about different cultures. There are now we have the religious divides, we have caste or hierarchies, and so on. All of these are different cultures eventually, and they, or rather, they kind of, it's like a chicken and egg kind of system where a culture gives, I mean, a religion gives rise to a kind of culture, a language gives rise to a kind of culture, an economy gives rise to a particular cultures, and so on and so forth. And their economy has always been that of looking and finding things in their immediate vicinity and depending on nature 100%. There was entire dependence on nature for their existence, from mostly from finding food to finding material artifacts for them to use as tools, and so on and so forth. And that's also been the case in mainland India. Now, in Telangana, where you're located currently, there are tribal communities there as well who are using bows and arrows, the Chenchus and other people also who are living over there, who also have been living very similar to these communities in the Andamans as well. But their contact with a mainland or a mainstream society or communities was much more than in the Andaman Nicobar. So that's another critical difference that one should kind of take into account when we try and kind of comprehend or understand who these islanders are. Um, and so after the British left and India came into being, like I told you, in 1956, when the then administration, people in the administration then realized that they said, let's try and do a kind of count of the people who are remaining, because it was just jungle. It hadn't been occupied completely by India as well. It was only mostly South Andaman and parts of Middle Andaman, which were occupied. We actually found 19 people, or counted 19 people. And those 19 people were spoken to through Hindi or even in broken Andamanese, or different, there are different dialects in Andamanese, and asked if they would like to kind of come together, because it was difficult for them to live alone by themselves. So the government of India actually brought these 19 people to live together in an island called Strait Island. And they are the people whom we today, and you'll see literature on by Dr. Anvita B and all, who have written about their language, about their folk tales and so on, refer to as the Great Andamanese. But the Great Andamanese originally consisted of, like I told you, of about 11 odd tribes. The Jarawa were a separate tribe, the Ongi are another tribe, the Sentinelese are another tribe. All slightly different dialects and different language, but all belong to the same language family of the Andamanese, the Andaman language family. And it is critical to note that in the entire world, the Andaman family of languages is a complete isolate. There is no other language on the planet which has any links to their language. It's there. It is just found there and only there in the Andaman Islands. So it's one of the world's most among the endangered languages of the world. When those 19 people were collected or brought into a Strait Island, there were a few others who also to be around 25 or maybe 30 odd people actually. Because I know of some of my colleagues who are very senior and old settlers from the islands, from Andaman in particular, who have lived with some of the Andamanese themselves, told me, and they've told us, or rather me and my colleagues, of Andamanese who did not go to Strait Island. They lived in the jungle. An old couple I know of. There was another lady called Tango. She lived on interview island as alone. Alone. There was nobody else. Nobody else from her tribe. She lived, the lady called Tango, she lived with a bunch of dogs. She had some 5, 6 dogs, or whatever remaining which she found in the forest from the old hunting people who left behind. She lived with those dogs. She used to hunt on her own with the dogs. And when these fishermen used to go and kind of camp on the beach, she would go and steal sometimes food from their camp, and that's how she survived. But eventually, when she died, she was the last person on the of the Andaman tribe from that particular island. She eventually died in the forest camp, I was told, in maybe in 50s or early 60s, maybe. People like them, like her, Tango, never went to Street Island. But these 19 people who were collected, they formed the original settler population of, I would call them the original settler population of the Great Andamans, who we refer to as the Great Andamans. Their population today is about 50 plus. They've intermarried with other communities from the mainland who live in the Andamans, amongst themselves as well, and have, have children, and those children have had children themselves, and so on. The population is slowly growing, but culturally they had to have an origin of being people who belong to different sub-tribal communities in the Andamans and so on. Okay, let me move on from there to the other community who are the Jarawa. And the Jarawa are the most numerous tribal community who live in the Andamans today. They number approximately about 500 odd people. I'm not sure the exact number that you can get from the government website and so on. Um, and they, when the government actually began working or even was able to do a full-fledged census of the Jarawa, if I'm right, the original number that they were able to count was somewhere close to 380 or 390 or something like that. Originally, I'm talking about originally meaning in after 1999 or 2000 maybe, when they were slowly becoming friendly and we were able to get some numbers, maybe early 2000s also, if I'm right. They were, and the population is since increased from that 390, 400 odd people to close to about 500 odd people today. Because there's no real hostility that like how used to exist in the past. The government actually has come about, the government of India, the Andaman administration, through various resources of both anthropologists, social workers, and the entire departmental setup, and others as well, have been able to establish these friend relations with the community we refer to as the Jarawa. The Jarawa themselves don't call themselves Jarawa. Like my name is Manish. Somebody else may call me Andaman researcher or whatever, but that's not my name. That's just somebody might refer to me as that guy. Like that, similarly, the Jarawa don't call themselves Jarawa. They call themselves Ang. That's the name for their tribe. Their actual name for the tribe is Ang. It's similar to the term for the Ungi. Ungi also refers to being humans of that island, the people of that island. Ang is the name for this particular community, and they're linguistically very closely associated with the Ongi community as well, but different from the other Andamanese in terms, at least linguistically. So these people live in the forest. They forests of South Andaman and Middle Andaman. They originally occupied South Andaman and Rutland Island, but once the Middle Andaman tribes had died out and became completely extinct, they moved on their own to Middle Andaman and eventually carved out a territory for their own use and which they were using, which after 1956, I think the 57 or 58 was when the notification was laid out by the government of India. And it's a pretty unique notification in the country, which most people or some people may not be aware of, is the Andaman Nicobar Protection of Aboriginal Tribes Regulation. It began in 1956, 57, wherein the government of India then had demarcated areas saying these particular areas, X, Y, Z, so on and so forth, from so on and so forth latitude, or this area, or this island, which is used by this particular community, belongs to those communities, and they should not be encroached upon or used in any other fashion. That virtually the entire Nicobar district, and virtually all the Nicobar Islands fall under the tribal reserve category. Similarly, in the Andamans, there's Little Andaman, which has had a huge tribal reserve, which is slowly being kind of now being eaten into. South Andaman has had its Jarawa tribal reserve, and Middle Andaman as well. And the people, those remnant 19 people who came and were settled on this island called Strait Island, even Strait Island falls under a tribal reserve. All the other islands were not categorized as tribal reserves because there were no tribal communities living on them anymore. And most of them are very tiny, small islands in any case. People weren't living. They used to just visit them to kind of collect sea turtles or fish or some birds or whatever and come back. No fresh water also on those islands easily to come by. And the others today have a varied population of people, mostly with origins from East Bengal, sorry, who came into India and eventually were settled by government of India as refugees from the Indo-Pak wars and from Bangladesh and so on. And they were the original settlers on the islands, along with people from the Mapla community in Kerala, people from some parts of Tamil Nadu, Andhra, in fact, from people from Andhra, from Simachalam, were brought into the islands as fishermen, settlers, because the people from Simachalam coastline who were fishermen were brought in as people who would cater to the settlement in the Andamans as fish to people who could bring in fish for sale and so on and so forth. So people who belong to the fishing community from that area, I know a lot of them. I've worked with some of them, and I mean, not all of them are from Simachalam, but many of them were from Simachalam. So, but they were brought into the islands in the early settlement as fishermen, as fisher folk who settled in the islands. Similarly, the people of Bengali origin from East Bengal, who came in as refugees during the wars and partition and so on, they were given land as settlers through South, Middle, and North, and Little Andaman, and so on. Then there were even people who were from other communities. So we have basically have virtually communities from virtually every state in the Andamans, except for the northeast states, and say Kashmir as well. I remember many years ago there used to be one of those Kashmir shops, Kashmiri shops. There's only people from Kashmir probably who are there in the Andamans. They would sell those shawls and other tourist kind of curios and all. I haven't talked to you about the Nicobar Islands at all. So the similarity is that they are also islanders. But what is different is that unlike in the Andamans, where you have an administration and a community who is dependent on mainland India. In fact, I have not even come to that. Talking about the settlement in Andaman Islands, like I told you, the people who are settled there from both from Srikakulam, from any state in India, from East Bengal and so on, they were all dependent on government subsidies, government input for them to be able to survive and kind of live in those. They're not the traditional homeland. They've been brought from another place and deposited virtually on into the island, saying we are giving you space to settle here, to conduct your bona fide activities of agriculture or fishing or public or private enterprise and so on, employment, and thereby occupy and settle the islands. So that's how the entire enterprise of settlement has taken shape, and how India kind of is the country which is administering and kind of running the economy in those islands, apart from the tribal economies. So the Nicobar, and that why is it different is the fact is that the indigenous or tribal communities in the Nicobar are much larger compared to the Andaman tribal community. Firstly, there was no settlement that happened in Nicobar except for a small settlement on Great Nicobar Island, small parts of Kamota, Kachar. But everywhere else, it's the Nicobaris themselves who live and work and exist on their own island. And there again, there are 6 dialects among the Nicobaris. From north to south, island by island, different dialects of Nicobaris are spoken, and culture is more or less similar. And the culture is an island culture of, again, subsisting off the land. They were, unlike the Andaman tribal communities, they were not hunter-gatherers. They were herders of pigs, of tenders of their plantations. They still have plantations of coconut trees and a few other trees, cultivate chilies and so on. Now, today, many of them are employed in government enterprise or their own enterprise of collecting coconuts for sale, processing them for oil and so on. So the difference is that the Andamans are mostly controlled by government and run by the government in that sense. The economy is dependent completely on government input, from tourism to government employment or anything else. In the Nicobars, their own economy is that of subsistence, and subsistence through production in their homesteads of both coconut, piggery, chickens. They don't sell any vegetables and all. They have their own vegetables where they have kitchen gardens. So they run a very unique island economy of their own.